Welcome again to another episode of Christian Answers, and I'm happy you can be along with us today for the journey we're on. We're answering questions that come up in the Christian life and from the Bible. We're also doing movie reviews. We're also taking some time off to talk about some of the programs that are out on TV and some of the movies that are out in the theaters. One of the movies we've been talking about, it's a television series. It's called AD, The Bible Continues. And I've been reviewing some of the episodes of AD as they come up every week on Sunday. Starting on Easter Sunday, the continuation of the movie, the Bible series, is shown every Sunday. And so now we're into the third episode. And we're after the resurrection of Christ. We're after his appearance to his disciples. And we're beginning to see some of the difficulty it is in trying to imagine what happened in the early church. The movie AD, The Bible Continues, is trying to portray what happened to the disciples, Peter, John, and the others, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the others, what actually happened to them after Jesus ascended into heaven and gave them the Great Commission to go forth into the world and preach the gospel. What really happened to them? Well, the TV series is trying to depict what happened to them, and it's very difficult to do that. And the reason it's difficult to do that is because the book of Acts, is which most of the material is given, doesn't have as much material about the disciples as it did about Jesus and the disciples before the crucifixion, the resurrection, a little bit afterwards. But it doesn't have a lot of the information that we wish we had, because if you remember, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just one book of Acts. And so you can imagine how difficult it is for the writers and producers of this TV series to try to come up with a script that would show what happens to the disciples from the main events in the book of Acts. Now, they do try to show what happens after the crucifixion of Jesus. He's put into the tomb, and then the tomb is found to be empty. And it shows that the Romans are trying to find out who stole the body. The Jewish authorities are trying to find out who stole the body. They assume that it was stolen. And the Roman soldiers that were there at the tomb, guarding the tomb, who saw the supernatural angel visitation, who moved the stone and Jesus come out of the tomb, they saw that. They were put to death. And then all of the temple guards that were there were put to death too. So there is an effort in the series, anyway, to show that there is a conspiracy to try to keep things quiet as to what actually happened at the tomb of Jesus Christ. And that's an interesting interpretation, because that is not shown in the Bible, that there is a conspiracy to try to silence the people who were eyewitnesses to the miracle of the resurrection. But in this TV series, that is a plausible occurrence. It could have happened that way. Pilate could have gone after the soldiers that were supposed to be guarding the tomb, and he could have also put to death the temple guards that were there at the tomb as well. So that's a plausible explanation. It does go into some detail, the TV series, showing the different struggles that Pilate had to go through, and Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas in this series is a quite dominant figure in the story of the early church. Now, we don't really know if Caiaphas was indeed that predominantly a player in the story of the early church, but he is in this TV depiction of it. And also Pilate is too. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. He is a prominent figure in the early story of the early church. Now, again, we don't know if that is in fact true. It could not, maybe it's not true. It could be true. We just don't have enough information from the Bible to say which one is the case. Now, it does show the disciples going back to Galilee, and that Galilee is the city way up north in Israel. And so Jerusalem being in the south, Galilee, it shows the disciples going up to Galilee. It shows Peter struggling to leave his family once again to come back into Jerusalem, because that's what the Lord said for him and his disciples to do, is to go back into Jerusalem. Now the problem with that is that people are looking for the disciples in Jerusalem. The Romans are looking for the disciples, according to this TV series, and the Jews are looking for the disciples of Jesus, because the Jewish leaders feel that they were the ones, the disciples were the ones that took the body, and the Romans want the disciples rounded up because they don't want any talk of the resurrection of Jesus. And so the disciples are asked by Jesus to go back into that environment, go back into that dangerous situation, and wait for the Holy Spirit. Jesus tells them before his ascension to specifically wait for the power of the Holy Spirit, to not go out and begin to spread the word of the resurrection, of the good news of Jesus Christ immediately, but to wait for the power of the Holy Spirit. Now that is a great and mighty theme in the early church. It's a great and mighty theme in the book of Acts. And so it's interesting how the TV series depicts that, and it does show the Holy Spirit coming down from heaven at Pentecost on the upper room where the disciples were gathered and where they were praying. And it shows it in a very creative way. What the TV series shows is that Peter and the disciples did in fact leave Galilee and go back into Jerusalem and were hiding out in the upper room. But then in the TV series it shows Peter's daughter had secretly followed and traveled all the way down from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem alone. Here is this teenage daughter, and she sees her father leaving with the disciples, and so she wants to follow. And so she comes all the way from Galilee into Jerusalem, and he sees her and finds her in Jerusalem. And she asks questions about the disciples and she learns about Jesus. Now, what's very unrealistic about that scenario is that you would never have ever had an unaccompanied woman traveling alone over any distance in the ancient world. It was just too dangerous, and she would not have had safety in doing that, and she wouldn't have probably even gotten to Jerusalem. And so that was very unrealistic. Another unrealistic aspect of it is this teenage girl is talking to her father like the contemporary modern teenagers talk to their parents, not with any necessary degree of respect. And she is questioning him and talking back to him in a very direct manner, and that is never the way a Jewish teenage girl would have talked in the first century. She would have looked to her father. She would have deferred to her father. Her father was the head of the household. And so this depiction is a modern depiction. It's putting modern style in modern ways into the ancient Christian early church. And so it's interesting to see that happening there. It's interesting to see how the writers and producers and directors of this TV series would read back into the text the modern habits of the teenagers today in questioning their parents and doing things like following after her father for a long distance on her own, independently. And that would never have ever happened in the ancient world. And so we see already the difficulty of trying to depict on television what the Bible is saying and trying to fill in the blanks. Because after all, we just have the scarcest of data as far as what actually happened in the book of Acts. And so there's all this material that needs to be added, and they do a pretty good job. But there are some places where it does get to be a little bit unbelievable. It doesn't seem to ring true as to what we know of the ancient world and what they're depicting on television. Well, don't go away. We're going to be back for part 2 of Christian Answers, where I talk more about the series AD, The Bible Continues. Well, welcome to part 2 of Christian Answers, and we're talking about the television series AD, The Bible Continues. And I have to say that this is a positive, this is an encouraging depiction of the biblical story. It does not do what so many of the modern and contemporary movies do, and that is essentially do an entire rewrite of the Bible. We saw that first of all, a year ago, we saw it in the movie about Noah and the flood, where that entire biblical account with Russell Crowe, the actor starring as Noah, that entire biblical account, when it's put on the movies by Hollywood directors and producers and writers, is an almost complete rewrite of the biblical story. And it really changes almost the whole fundamental character of the account in the Bible. So I did a critical review of that because I did not like the way they changed so many things and added parts and had a different agenda than what the Bible actually had in retelling that story. Well, then we saw, just a few months ago, we saw the movie Exodus, starring Christian Bale as Moses. And again, that movie did very much what the Noah and the flood did, only not as bad. I have to say, it wasn't as bad as the Noah movie, but it was a great departure from the Bible. It did not stand and stick with the Bible account. It actually added things. Probably the most offensive thing that it added was it made the voice of God and the character of God, it depicted as a small boy, a young boy who was always angry and who was always mean and always speaking harshly to Moses. And that was probably the most offensive part in the Exodus movie starring Christian Bale. And so today, when we talk about the Bible series on television, it is really refreshing to see that here they have gone back to the Bible and they've actually tried to stay faithful to the way the Bible actually gives the account of what is happening. Now again, they do have to fill in the details because the Bible, especially in the book of Acts, does not give us a whole lot of details. It does give us details. It gives us the accounts of what actually happened in the early church. But there is so much that is skipped and there's so much left unsaid. And as you can imagine, a lot of things took place after Jesus had risen from the dead and ascended into heaven. And we have one book that describes most of it, and that's the book of Acts. And in the Gospels, we have 4 Gospels, and they all fill in the details of the life and times of Jesus Christ. And so we have more information in the Gospels, but for the book of Acts, we have just this one account, and we have to rely on it, and we have to try to put 2 and 2 together to try to figure out what was actually happening. Well, the movie AD, The Bible Continues, tries to do that every week, and it's doing a pretty good job, but it's running into the scarcity of information in the book of Acts, and so it has to fill in the blanks. And so what it's doing is it's trying to develop the characters. It's trying to develop Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. It's trying to develop Herod, the king, the so-called king of the Jews. He was a puppet king placed there by the Romans, but he was a king, and he was ruling at the time. And then it tries to fill in the blanks for Caiaphas, who was the head priest at the time. And so you have these 3 characters, and they are, the movie, AD, The Bible Continues, is trying to fill in these characters and give us more information that the Bible does not give us, but it tries to be consistent with what the Bible is giving us. For example, it shows Caiaphas, the high priest, and his wife, and it shows that his wife is almost just as much a politician as he is. It shows Pontius Pilate and his wife interacts quite a bit with Pontius Pilate. We don't know if she did that or not. We do know from the Gospels that she did talked to Pontius Pilate about the trial and death of Jesus and warned him against crucifying Jesus. He didn't listen to her, but we did see a little interaction with Pontius Pilate and his wife, and so they try to pick up on that in this series on TV and show her interacting. Now, Caiaphas, the head priest, we do not know anything about his wife, but they do bring in his wife in the television series, and she interacts quite a bit. And so they bring some unusual kind of storylines. For example, one of the storylines that they show in this series is that Caiaphas' wife goes and visits in Jerusalem the family of one of the temple guards that was put to death by Pontius Pilate for being at the site of the grave site and the resurrection site. See, according to the storyline in this TV series, Pontius Pilate wanted everyone dead who was on the ground right there where the grave of Jesus was and who saw this supernatural thing happen. He wanted them all dead in the superstition, he thought. And so he killed the Roman soldiers, and he also had the temple guards, the ones who were Jewish who went to the grave site to guard it also, he had them put to death. And so Caiaphas' wife goes to one of the family members of one of the temple guards and says that the temple cannot officially compensate her and provide for her in the death of her husband, but that Caiaphas and his wife and some of the other leaders will do that out of their own expenses. And she was wondering why. Why can't the temple recognize my husband and his service as a temple guard? And she begins to, Caiaphas' wife begins to show why that's impossible. And then she winds up telling the family that they actually have to leave Jerusalem, and they will be compensated for that and everything like that. So there's definitely, in this depiction of the Bible, there's a storyline that says there's a conspiracy to try to put down any idea that anything unusual happened at the grave, that somebody stole the body or something unusual happened. They're trying to put a squelch on any rumors that might occur, and if these temple guards and the Roman soldiers had been alive, they might have talked, and so they actually show this conspiracy with Pilate and Caiaphas to try to end any kind of speculation as to what happened to the body of Jesus. In fact, the Roman soldiers, under the orders of Pilate, according to this depiction, actually went back to the grave and sealed it again, put the stone back in front of it and sealed it again in order to act as if nothing had happened and that the body of Jesus was safely in there and nothing out of the ordinary. So that is to the degree they went to perpetuate this conspiracy of silence. And so it's interesting. We don't know if that actually happened. We have no evidence that the Romans went back to the tomb and resealed it and tried to act like nothing was out of order. We don't have any hardcore evidence that Caiaphas and Pilate were trying to put down any rumors of the resurrection. Although we do know that the Jews, Caiaphas and some of the Pharisees and scribes, they came up with that idea of the disciples stole the body. And so that was the storyline that was supposed to be told over and over amongst the Jews. Well, that did pretty much stick. That talking point stuck among the Jews, and we see that even today. Something occurred there, and they don't believe it was the resurrection, so they had to give it some other identification. Well, we're going to be talking more about this depiction of the book of Acts in the third segment, so don't go away. Well, welcome to the third segment of Christian Answers, and we're talking about the movie, the television movie, made for television series, AD, the Bible Continues. And we're talking about the different ways that they try to bring the Bible alive, and I appreciate that. One of the things they did was they tried to depict the coming of the Holy Spirit. Now, before the Holy Spirit came, it was somewhat interesting how they were talking about it. The daughter of Peter in this storyline had followed secretly the disciples from Galilee to Jerusalem. She comes into the upper room and she says, "What are you waiting here? Why are you waiting in this room, hiding out when you should be out there? If you believe in Jesus and his resurrection, you should be out there preaching amongst the people." And Peter tells his daughter, "We're waiting for the Holy Spirit." And she asked, "What is the Holy Spirit?" They were not quite sure. And she asked, "Well, when is the Holy Spirit coming?" And they said, "Well, we don't really know that." And so it's sort of an awkward conversation. We're waiting for something. We don't know what it's coming. We don't know when it's coming, but we'll know when we see it. That's what Peter says. We'll know when we see it. And so it's kind of an interesting twist on how did they wait. But then it also shows the daughter of Peter talking to him on the rooftop in Jerusalem. And Peter's not quite sure what to do. And so she suggests that they pray, that the disciples pray. It's the daughter who suggests that Peter prays. And then so he goes and gathers all the disciples and they begin to pray. And that's when the Holy Spirit comes down. It shows this almost like a comet from heaven coming from the sky, and all the clouds begin to turn dark, and there becomes a strong wind begins to whip up around the house there, and it shows fire from heaven coming down, and it begins to show fire circulating amongst the disciples as they are praying, and then it shows them switching from their common language into the many languages that occurred at the day of Pentecost. And so it tries to depict that scene of the coming of the Holy Spirit. Now, I have to admit, that would be a very difficult scene to depict in a movie or even in artwork. If you see the great classics of Christian art, you'll see that there are all kinds of different ways they depict it. Some show little flames on top of each of the disciples' head. Some show a fire in the background, the fire of the Holy Spirit. Some show the wind and all this stuff. It's a very difficult thing to kind of get into mind what actually happened. But it shows that they were praying, and that's accurate from the Bible. They were in prayer. They went to prayer continually. They didn't probably go to prayer based on the suggestion of a little teenage girl, as it showed in the TV series. Peter, I do believe, had more leadership ability, and he had more spiritual common sense to know when and when not to pray. He didn't need his teenage daughter to come up with a novel idea the way it was shown in the TV series, like, "Hey, why don't you pray?" I think they were already on top of that. I think they were already into prayer before the teenage daughter came from Galilee and joined them. And so it shows some different angles that might have happened. It did show that they were praying. It did show that they were, in this instance, they were praying the Lord's Prayer, and the Holy Spirit came, and they began to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And then after that, they went out, because Peter said, "Now we are going to leave this place, this room." And they went out into the city. They didn't care whether they were wanted men. They didn't care whether the Romans were looking for them or the Jewish leaders were looking for them. They went out boldly. Now that they had the Holy Spirit, they went boldly out and they began to preach the gospel. And it shows Peter healing a crippled man, which is biblical, which is very accurate. And it showed them getting arrested, which is very biblically accurate. So I think the writers and producers and directors did a good job in trying to pull together all of what we do know happened and then add their own special twist to what happened to try to make it interesting. Now, the thing is that they did interject some of our modern ways, like I said before, the way the teenage daughter independently left home and traveled alone, and the way she talked to her father and it was bold and talked to him forthrightly and those kind of things. Those are anachronistic. They don't really fit the way the biblical story would have unfolded. But they added a little bit of an interesting twist, because you have to realize that in doing a television movie like this, they have to try to, in some sense, appeal to many people, and they have to try to stay within the biblical framework. And they have done a pretty good job of that. But see, some of the things that they do to try to appeal to people, I think the addition of the teenage girl amongst the disciples was an attempt to try to draw in younger viewers. I don't know that for sure, but I would have guessed that they're trying to reach younger viewers with that. I do know that depicting the disciples as African, some of the disciples, maybe 2 or 3 of them as African, is an attempt to reach a demographic in our population, no question about that, because in fact, we know that all of the disciples at that early stage were Jewish, because that is where the early church was born, in Jerusalem. Now, later on, when the Apostle Paul's ministry, we see Gentiles coming into the church, and then you would see people from all of the different nations of the world coming into the Christian faith. But at this early stage, there was not a great deal of ethnic diversity in the church. It was mostly 100% Jewish. And so that's the actual state of the biblical description. But I can understand if you're trying to appeal to a wide audience and you want people to watch this and you want people to understand what the Bible is saying in the broad and general sense, you do add these modern twists to the story. And it didn't really take away much at all from the biblical account. So I will still give them good high marks for this. And stay tuned. We're going to be reviewing this series every week, not every chronological week, but every so often we're going to be reviewing this series, and we're going to be keeping you up to date on the commentary on this series. So hope you've enjoyed this. We'll see you back here next week on Christian Answers. Have a great day.